The wind howled like a wounded beast, carrying sharp grains of sand that lashed against Ethan Carter's face. He pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders and squinted into the swirling storm. The night was cold, the air thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. He had seen many dangerous storms on this planet, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just the storm that sent a chill down his spine. It was the feeling that he was being watched. Ethan had been traveling alone for months, taking odd jobs across the galaxy, trying to escape a past he didn't want to remember. He had stopped here, on the desolate planet of Veloria, to rest before continuing his journey. The planet was mostly barren, with few settlements, and even fewer people. It was a place where no one asked questions. That was why he liked it. But now, in the middle of this deadly storm, he saw something, or someone, moving in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the wind, but then he saw it again. A dark, hooded figure, barely visible through the thick curtain of sand, stumbling toward his shelter. Ethan frowned. No sane person would be out in a storm like this. Whoever they were either desperate or foolish. Probably both. The figure collapsed just a few feet away from his shelter. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He didn't owe anyone anything. This wasn't his problem. But something inside him, some instinct he couldn't ignore, made him step forward. As he got closer, he saw the figure more clearly. It was a woman, her cloak torn and covered in dust. She was curled protectively around a small bundle in her arms. Ethan's stomach tightened when he realized it was a child. She was barely conscious, her breathing ragged. He crouched down, brushing the sand from her face. Her skin was a strange shade of violet, her features delicate yet unmistakably alien. She wasn't human. The child stirred, letting out a weak, frightened whimper. It was smaller than Ethan expected, its tiny hands clutching at the woman's cloak. Ethan cursed under his breath. This was bad. He had seen too many desperate people in his life, and he knew that those who ran were always running from something. If she was here, on this abandoned planet, alone in the storm, she was hiding. And hiding meant danger. Still, he couldn't just leave them there. "Hey," he said, his voice rough from the dry air. "Can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, silver, glowing softly in the dim light. She looked at him for a moment, dazed and afraid, before her body gave out, and she slumped into unconsciousness. Ethan sighed. Just my luck. Lifting her gently, he carried her inside his shelter. The place was small, nothing more than a temporary hideout, but it was warm and dry. He set her down on a pile of blankets, carefully unwrapping the child from her arms. The little one was awake now, big, frightened silver eyes tearing up at him. The child didn't cry, just clung tightly to the edge of the woman's cloak, as if afraid Ethan might take her away. "It's okay, kid," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if that was true. He turned his attention back to the woman. She was breathing, but barely. He found a canteen of water and carefully poured a little between her lips. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. Ethan sat back and ran a hand through his messy dark hair. Who was she? Why was she here? And why did she have a child with her? Something about this felt wrong. His instincts told him that whatever trouble she was in would soon become his trouble. Outside, the storm raged on. Ethan sighed. What have I gotten myself into? Ethan sat by the fire, watching the alien woman's chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. The storm outside had settled, but the unease inside him only grew stronger. He had seen many desperate people in his lifetime, but there was something different about this one. She wasn't just running, she was hiding, and that meant someone was looking for her. The child sat silently beside her, wide silver eyes locked onto Ethan. The little one hadn't said a word since waking up, just clung to the woman's cloak, as if letting go would make her disappear. Ethan wasn't good with kids. He had spent most of his life as a soldier, then a drifter. Taking care of people had never been part of the plan. Still, he found himself reaching for a ration pack. He tore it open, and placed it on the ground between them. Hungry. The child hesitated, then slowly reached out, grabbing the food with small, delicate hands. Ethan watched as the little one nibbled cautiously, still keeping a wary eye on him. "Smart kid," he muttered. The woman stirred, a weak groan escaping her lips. Ethan leaned forward as her silver eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she looked disoriented, then panic flashed across her face. She sat up too quickly, wincing as pain shot through her body. "Easy," Ethan said, raising a hand. "You're safe. For now." Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the child first. She exhaled in relief, pulling the little one close. Then her gaze locked onto Ethan, and the fear returned. "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "I could ask you the same," Ethan replied. "But since I'm the one who pulled you out of the storm, maybe you should go first." She hesitated, then glanced at the child before looking back at him. "My name is Zyra." Ethan nodded. "All right, Zyra. And the kid?" The woman's arms tightened around the child. "Her name is Ayla." Zyra looked down at her daughter, brushing a strand of silvery hair from her small face. "She is all that matters." Ethan crossed his arms. "And why exactly are you out here, in the middle of nowhere, running through a storm with a kid?" She was silent for a long time. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "We are being hunted." Ethan wasn't surprised, but the weight of her words still hit hard. "By who?" Zyra swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "A warlord named Decorus. He rules the outer systems with no mercy. His army burns planets to the ground. He destroys anyone who stands in his way." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "And what does he want with you?" Zyra hesitated. Then she did something that made Ethan's blood run cold. She unfastened the clasp of her cloak, letting it slip from her shoulders. Underneath she wore tattered clothing, but what caught Ethan's attention wasn't her outfit. It was the marking on her arm, a glowing, intricate symbol that pulsed with faint energy. Ethan had seen that symbol before. It belonged to the royal bloodline of Silara, a powerful empire that had once ruled half the galaxy before it was destroyed. "You're a Xilarian," Ethan muttered. Zyra nodded. "I am the last." Ethan exhaled sharply. This just kept getting worse. "The warlord," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "wants my daughter. Ayla is the rightful heir to the Xilarian throne. If Decorus captures her, he will use her blood to claim power. And no one will be able to stop him." Ethan ran a hand down his face. "Great, so you're telling me the most dangerous warlord in the galaxy is chasing you. And now, because I helped you, me too." Zyra met his gaze, her silver eyes pleading. "Please, I had nowhere else to go. I need your help." Ethan shook his head. "Lady, I'm just a guy trying to keep my own head down. I don't get involved in wars, royal bloodlines, or crazy warlords." Zyra's hands tightened into fists. "Then why did you save me?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have an answer. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to admit. Before he could respond, the child, Ayla, suddenly gasped. Ethan followed her gaze to the entrance of his shelter. Through the small crack in the metal door, a red light flickered in the distance. Then another, and another. Ethan's heart pounded. He knew what that was. Tracking drones. They had been found. Zyra clutched Ayla to her chest, her breathing ragged. Ethan grabbed his weapon and moved toward the door, cursing under his breath. "So much for keeping my head down." Outside, the first shadows of Decorus's soldiers appeared in the storm. Ethan's grip tightened on his weapon as the red lights grew closer. The storm outside had died down, leaving behind an eerie silence. The only sounds were the distant hum of tracking drones and the faint whirring of approaching footsteps. Decorus's men were here. And they weren't here for a friendly visit. Zyra held Ayla tightly, pressing the child against her chest. Her silver eyes flickered with fear, but she remained silent. She knew, just as Ethan did, that any sound could give away their exact position. Ethan took a slow breath, his mind racing. He had been in worse situations before. Ambushes, betrayals, impossible odds. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just looking out for himself. Ayla suddenly whimpered, sensing the danger in the air. Zyra gently rocked her, whispering something in a language Ethan didn't understand. The soft glow in the child's eyes dimmed as she nestled against her mother. Ethan turned back toward the door. The soldiers were getting closer. He could hear them now. Metal boots crunching against the ground, the clicking of weapons being prepared, and the low murmur of voices speaking in a coded dialect. His escape routes were limited. The shelter was a temporary outpost, built for short stays, not defense. There was a back exit, but it led to open terrain, nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. If they tried to flee, they'd be cut down before they made it 50 feet. He had one choice: fight. Ethan pulled a small device from his belt and pressed a button. Instantly, the lights inside the shelter flickered and died, plunging the space into darkness. Zara tensed. "What are you doing?" "Leveling the playing field," Ethan whispered. "They have night vision tech, but I have something better." From his vest, he pulled out a small visor and slipped it over his eyes. It wasn't just night vision. It was an advanced combat HUD designed for rapid targeting and thermal detection. It would give him a brief but crucial advantage. A soft beep sounded from his wrist communicator. The drones had locked onto their location. The moment of silence before the attack stretched endlessly. Then, boom! The front door exploded inward, sending a wave of fire and debris through the shelter. Ethan rolled to the side, shielding his face as smoke filled the air. His visor adjusted instantly, scanning the figures moving through the dust cloud. 4 men, heavily armored, armed with plasma rifles. They moved in quickly, expecting an easy capture. They didn't know Ethan. Before the first soldier could react, Ethan fired 2 precise shots, striking him in the chest. The impact sent the man sprawling backward, his armor sizzling from the energy blast. The second soldier turned his rifle toward Ethan, but Ethan was faster. He dropped to one knee and fired again, hitting the man's knee joint. The soldier crumpled with a sharp cry. The remaining 2 hesitated. They hadn't expected resistance. Zyra took advantage of the moment. She lifted her hand, and the marking on her arm glowed fiercely. The air crackled as a surge of energy pulsed outward. The closest soldier was thrown backward, his armor sparking violently as he hit the wall. Ethan shot the last one before he could call for backup. The soldier fell, smoke rising from his armor. Then silence. The room was filled with the acrid scent of burnt metal and plasma residue. Ethan exhaled, lowering his weapon. Zara clutched Ayla tightly, her breathing shaky. They found us so fast. Ethan glanced at the fallen soldiers, his mind piecing together the problem. This wasn't just a random patrol. This was a tracking squad. That meant more would come. A soft static noise came from one of the soldiers' helmets. Ethan stepped forward and ripped it off, bringing it to his ear. "Unit 4, report." The voice was cold and mechanical. Ethan didn't answer. "Unit 4, status report. Are the targets secured?" Still, Ethan remained silent. Then, a low chuckle came through the speaker. "You thought you could run forever, princess." The voice said, amusement dripping from every word. "You disappoint me." Zyra's face paled. She knew that voice. Ethan did too, because he had heard stories of the man behind it. Decorus. Before Ethan could respond, a high-pitched alarm went off from the fallen soldier's armor. His eyes widened. "Get down," Ethan shouted. The bodies of the soldiers detonated instantly, the explosion sending fire and shrapnel through the shelter. Ethan shielded Zyra and Ayla as the blast rocked the ground beneath them. When the dust cleared, the shelter was nearly destroyed. The walls were crumbling, The entrance was obliterated, and outside, through the thick smoke, Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold. An entire fleet of ships descending from the sky. Decuris wasn't playing games. He wasn't sending a handful of soldiers to capture them. He was sending an army. Ethan gritted his teeth. He had survived many impossible situations, but this was going to be hell. Ethan's ears were still ringing from the explosion, but he didn't have time to recover. The sky above the ruins of his shelter was filled with descending warships, their sleek black exteriors reflecting the dim glow of the distant stars. Decuris wasn't sending just a squad. He was sending an entire invasion force. Zyra coughed, her arms still wrapped tightly around Ayla. The little girl trembled but made no sound. She understood, even at her young age, that crying would only make things worse. Ethan's mind worked fast. He had two choices, run or fight. Staying here was suicide. But running, that wasn't exactly promising either. Where could they go? Decuris had sent tracking squads. That meant he had access to orbital scanners. He would find them no matter where they hid. Still, Ethan had survived worse. He had one rule in life: never die easy. "Can you walk?" he asked Zyra. She nodded, though her movements were shaky. The energy blast she'd used earlier had drained her, and the weight of fear was pressing down hard. But she wasn't giving up. Not yet. "Good," Ethan said, "because we're leaving. Now." He turned toward the back of the destroyed shelter, where a collapsed wall had left an opening to the wild terrain beyond. The ground outside was uneven, jagged cliffs, and deep ravines stretching into the distance. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. Ethan grabbed a pack from the rubble, checking its contents. A few energy cells, a field medkit, some rations. It would have to do. He slung the pack over his shoulder, then motioned for Zyra to follow. Just as they stepped toward the opening, a low mechanical growl echoed through the air. Ethan froze. He turned his head slowly, and his stomach dropped. Standing in the entrance of the ruined shelter was a hunter drone. The machine stood at least 8 feet tall, its sleek black frame pulsing with crimson energy. A single red eye in the center of its head focused directly on Ethan, scanning him with a laser so bright it burned against his skin. Ethan didn't breathe. These things weren't normal drones. They were designed for one thing: eliminating high-value targets. They didn't capture. They didn't hesitate. They killed. The drone's voice came through its speaker, cold and emotionless. Target acquired. Ethan moved instantly. He grabbed a plasma grenade from his belt and hurled it toward the drone, diving toward Zyra and Ayla just as the explosion rocked the room. The blast ripped through metal and stone, sending shrapnel flying in all directions. But Ethan already knew the truth. That wouldn't kill it. Through the smoke, a dark silhouette emerged. The hunter drone's armor was damaged but intact, its single red eye flickering as it recalibrated. Ethan gritted his teeth. It wasn't done yet. The drone lunged forward, its razor-sharp metal claws slashing through the air. Ethan barely dodged in time, rolling across the ground as the machine's strike tore into the stone behind him. He needed an opening. "Zyra," he shouted, "can you?" Before he could finish, Zyra lifted her hands, and a surge of blue energy crackled around her body. Her marking flared to life, pulsing with ancient power. The hunter drone paused, its red eye flickering again. It was scanning her now, recognizing the symbol for what it was. Ethan saw his chance. He grabbed his rifle, switched to armor-piercing rounds, and fired 3 precise shots into the drone's exposed joints. The bullets tore through metal, and the machine staggered for just a second. That was all Zyra needed. With a shout, she unleashed her power, sending a shockwave of energy straight into the drone. The force lifted it off the ground, slamming it into the wreckage of the shelter. Sparks exploded from its body as its circuits fried. The drone collapsed, its red eye flickering once before going dark. Ethan exhaled. That was Close. Zara didn't respond. She swayed on her feet, her body drained from the effort. Ethan caught her before she could fall. "You need to stop doing that," he muttered, lowering her gently onto a piece of broken metal. Zara's breath was ragged. "I had no choice." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. He had known Zara was powerful, but this was different. And now, Dakaris knew exactly where they were. From above, the sound of engines roared as the enemy ships descended. Ethan turned toward the cliffs. He hated this plan, but he hated getting captured even more. "Come on," he said, pulling Zara to her feet. "We run now, or we don't run at all." Zara nodded weakly. She held Ayla close, pressing a kiss to her daughter's head before looking at Ethan. "Lead the way." Ethan took one last look at the burning wreckage of his former home. Then he turned, leading them into the dark wilderness beyond. The hunt had only just begun. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning metal. Ethan pushed forward, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he guided Zara and Ayla through the rugged landscape. Behind them, the remains of his shelter lay in ruins, and above, the dark sky buzzed with enemy warships scanning the terrain. Every step felt like walking a thin wire between life and death. Zara stumbled slightly, her body still weak from the energy she had unleashed against the hunter drone. Ethan caught her before she could fall, gripping her arm firmly but gently. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low but urgent. "They'll send more." Zara nodded, though exhaustion was written across her face. She adjusted Ayla in her arms, the little girl burying her face in her mother's shoulder. She was scared, but silent. Smart kid. Ethan scanned their surroundings. The terrain was rough, jagged cliffs, deep crevices, and patches of thick, thorny vegetation. This planet was harsh, but it might just work in their favor. "There's a cave system up ahead," he said, pointing toward a series of rocky outcrops in the distance. "If we can make it there, we might be able to shake them." Zara didn't argue. She just followed, trusting him. But the enemy was relentless. A high-pitched whir split the night air, followed by the unmistakable sound of aerial drones closing in. Ethan's grip tightened around his rifle. He could make out 3 of them, hovering just above the cliffs, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. They were being tracked. He cursed under his breath. There was no way they could outrun drones. They needed a plan. Fast. Ethan pulled Zara and Ayla behind a rocky ledge, pressing them close to the stone as the drones swept overhead. The bright beams of light passed dangerously close, illuminating the sweat on Ethan's brow. He took a deep breath, then turned to Zara. "Can you disable them?" Zara's face was pale. I don't have enough energy left. Not without rest." Ethan's jaw clenched. He could try shooting them down. But the moment he fired, they'd call for reinforcements. They needed a way to take them out silently. Then an idea struck him. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small round device, an EMP charge. It wasn't powerful enough to disable a warship, but for drones, it was perfect. Ethan set the device, his fingers moving quickly as he adjusted the timer. He had one shot at this. He tossed the EMP charge into the air, and for a split second, nothing happened. Then, a pulse of blue energy erupted outward. The drones shuddered, their engines flickering. One by one, they dropped from the sky, crashing onto the rocky terrain below. Silence followed. Zara exhaled in relief. That was effective. Ethan grinned, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "Let's hope Dakaris doesn't have more of those waiting for us." He motioned for them to move, and they hurried toward the caves. The entrance was hidden behind a wall of jagged rocks, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. Ethan squeezed through first, his rifle raised, scanning the darkness ahead. The tunnel was deep, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. It was perfect. "We'll rest here," he said, helping Zara inside. She sat down against the cool stone, cradling Ayla against her chest. The little girl had finally dozed off, exhaustion overcoming her fear. Ethan set down his pack and pulled out a small energy ration. He handed it to Zara. "Eat. You need your strength." She hesitated, but eventually took it, nibbling at the edge of the nutrient bar. For a few moments, there was only silence. The kind of silence that felt too heavy, too fragile. Then, Zara spoke. "Why are you helping us?" Ethan leaned back against the stone, exhaling slowly. "Because I don't like bullies," he said simply. "And because I know what it's like to be hunted." Zara watched him carefully, as if searching for something in his expression. Then she nodded. "Thank you." Ethan shrugged. "Don't thank me yet." He glanced toward the cave entrance, where the dim light of the planet's twin moons barely reached. "We're not safe. Not yet." But as Zara closed her eyes, her hand still resting protectively on Ayla's back, Ethan made a silent promise to himself. He would get them through this, no matter what it took. The cave was silent except for the distant drip of water echoing through the tunnels. The cold air pressed in around them, but Ethan welcomed it. It meant they were hidden, at least for now. He sat with his back against the stone wall, his rifle resting across his lap, eyes scanning the entrance. Zara and Ayla were curled up on a flat rock nearby, exhaustion pulling them into sleep. Even in the dim light, Ethan could see the deep lines of worry on Zara's face. She hadn't slept properly in days, yet she refused to fully let her guard down. Ethan understood that feeling all too well. His mind replayed everything that had happened over the last few hours. The attack, the drones, the escape. Decorus wasn't just hunting them anymore. He was closing in. Ethan had faced dangerous enemies before, but this was different. Decorus wasn't just any warlord. He was a strategist, a monster who enjoyed playing with his prey before delivering the final blow. And now, Ethan was standing in his way. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. Panic wouldn't help them. He needed a plan. The cave stretched for miles, an underground maze that could be both a blessing and a curse. If they took a wrong turn, they could be trapped. But if they played it right, they could use the tunnels to lose their pursuers. Ethan reached into his pack and pulled out a small holomap. The screen flickered to life, displaying a rough blueprint of the terrain. He studied it carefully, tracing possible routes with his finger. There. A hidden exit. If they could reach it, they might be able to get out undetected. But the path wouldn't be easy. Narrow tunnels, unstable ground, and a dangerous drop at the end. Still, it was their best shot. He turned toward Zara, debating whether to wake her. She needed rest, but they couldn't stay here much longer. The enemy was methodical. They'd be sweeping the area soon. And when they did, this cave would turn into a death trap. Before he could decide, a sound echoed through the tunnel, a deep mechanical hum. Ethan stiffened. He knew that sound. Hunter drones. Zara woke instantly, her eyes snapping open. She must have sensed it too. She sat up, pulling Ayla close, her expression shifting from exhaustion to determination. "They're here," she whispered. Ethan nodded, already moving. "We have to go. Now." Zara didn't hesitate. She lifted Ayla into her arms, holding her close as they crept deeper into the tunnels. Ethan led the way, moving quickly but carefully. The cave walls grew tighter as they advanced, the air thick with dust. Every sound felt magnified. Even their breathing seemed too loud. Then, a flash of red light illuminated the tunnel behind them. Ethan spun around. A hunter drone hovered in the distance, its single glowing eye scanning the darkness. It had found them. "Move!" Ethan shouted. The drone let out a high-pitched screech and fired. A plasma blast seared through the tunnel, barely missing them as Ethan shoved Zara forward. The heat from the blast scorched the rock, sending dust and debris flying. They ran. The tunnel sloped downward, twisting and turning like a labyrinth. Ethan knew they were close to the exit, but the drone was gaining on them. Ethan turned and fired a shot. aiming for its exposed circuits. The bullet hit dead center, but the drone barely flinched. Damn it. These things were built to withstand direct attacks. He needed something stronger. He reached for his last plasma grenade. One shot. If he missed, they were dead. The drone charged forward, its claws extending. Ethan pulled the pin, waited for the perfect moment, then threw the grenade straight at its core. Boom! The explosion rocked the tunnel, sending a shockwave through the cave. The drone was blown backward, its body crashing against the walls before hitting the ground in a heap of smoking metal. But the blast had weakened the tunnel. The ceiling rumbled. Rocks began to crack and fall. "Run!" Ethan shouted. They sprinted forward as the cave behind them collapsed, sealing off the tunnel. Dust filled the air, making it hard to see, but when the rumbling stopped, they were still standing. They had made it. Ethan coughed, waving away the dust. Ahead, he could see a faint blue glow. The exit. He turned to Zara. "You okay?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. Ayla was still clinging to her, eyes wide but alive. Ethan exhaled. They weren't safe yet, but they had survived one more fight. And he knew one thing for sure. Dakaris would not stop. If they wanted to escape, they needed to do more than run. They needed to end this. Ethan took a deep breath as they stepped out of the cave and into the open world once more. The cold air hit his face, carrying the scent of damp earth and burning metal from the recent battle. His muscles ached. His wounds throbbed, but there was no time to rest. They had escaped the cave, but Dakaris wouldn't stop hunting them. Zara held Ayla close, scanning the dark horizon. They had come out near the edge of a massive canyon. The ground sloped downward into a deep ravine filled with jagged rocks and thick mist. No easy way forward. Ethan pulled out his holomap, studying their options. "We can't stay here," he muttered. "They'll track the explosion. We have to keep moving." Zara nodded, though exhaustion was clear in her eyes. "Where do we go?" Ethan traced his finger along the map. "There's an old outpost about 20 miles east. If we can reach it, we might find weapons, supplies, maybe even a way to send a distress signal." Zara hesitated. "You really think someone will come for us?" Ethan didn't answer. The truth was, he wasn't sure. But he knew one thing. If they stayed out in the open, they were dead. Ayla tugged on Zara's sleeve. "Mama, I'm hungry." Ethan reached into his pack, pulling out a ration bar. He handed it to the child, who took it with wide, grateful eyes. Too young to understand the danger, too wise to complain. He admired that. Zara touched his arm. "Thank you." Ethan shrugged. "Let's go." They moved fast, keeping low as they navigated the canyon's edge. The terrain was rough, the wind howling through the jagged cliffs. Then, a distant roar. Ethan froze. He knew that sound. Starships. He turned his gaze upward and saw them. 3 black ships sliced through the sky, their searchlights scanning the canyon below. Dakaris had sent his hunters. Ethan's pulse quickened. They were running out of time. "We need to find cover," he whispered. "Now." Zara nodded, clutching Ayla tightly as they hurried down a steep path, their boots kicking up dust. The mist swirled around them, making visibility difficult. The first ship passed overhead, its engines rumbling. A loud voice boomed from the sky. "Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift. Continue running, and you will suffer." Ethan clenched his fists. Dakaris was playing his usual game. Fear, intimidation. He wanted them broken before he killed them. Not happening. Zara's breathing was heavy as they crouched behind a rock formation, watching the ships circle like vultures. Ayla whimpered, burying her face in her mother's chest. Ethan looked around desperately. They needed a way out. Then he saw it. A narrow bridge of rock stretched across the canyon, partially hidden by the mist. A dangerous path, but their best chance. "Over there," he whispered. "We cross that bridge. We disappear into the valley." Zura's eyes widened. It's unstable. Better than staying here. She nodded. They moved quickly, stepping onto the rock bridge. Below them, a sheer drop into darkness. The wind was fierce, threatening to throw them off balance. One step, another. Don't look down. Then, a gunshot. A bullet shattered the rock near Ethan's foot. He spun around. Troopers. Dakaris's men were on the canyon's edge, weapons raised. Run, Ethan shouted. Zura clutched Ayla and sprinted forward. Ethan fired back, covering them. One trooper fell, another ducked. But there were too many. The bridge trembled. Cracks splintered beneath their feet. Ethan, Zura cried. He turned and saw the rock collapsing. He lunged, pushing Zura and Ayla forward just as the bridge gave way beneath him. For a split second, he felt weightless. The world blurred. Then, a hard impact. Pain shot through his body as he hit an outcropping of rock below. Not a fatal fall, but close enough. Above, Zura screamed his name. The last thing Ethan saw before his vision blurred was the ship circling above. Then, everything went black. Ethan's consciousness flickered in and out like a broken transmission. Pain wrapped around his body like a vice, every breath a struggle. He could hear the distant hum of engines, the sound of wind whipping through the canyon. Somewhere above, Zura and Ayla were still out there. Still running, still fighting. He had to move. With a groan, he rolled onto his side, feeling the sharp sting of bruised ribs. Blood trickled down his forehead, blurring his vision. His body protested, but he forced himself up, his hand gripping the rocky ground for support. The fall hadn't killed him, which meant Dakaris's men would finish the job. Ethan scanned his surroundings. He had landed on a narrow ledge, barely stable enough to hold his weight. Below him, nothing but a sheer drop into the abyss. Climbing up wasn't an option, not with Dakaris's troops swarming above. Then he spotted it. A rusted maintenance ladder, bolted into the canyon wall. Old, unstable, but his only way out. He reached for it, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal. The ladder groaned under his weight as he began to climb. Every movement sent fire through his body, but he pushed through the pain. He wasn't dying here. Not today. As he reached the top, he heard voices. Dakaris's soldiers. They were close. Too close. Check the wreckage, one ordered. If he survived, I want his head. Ethan pressed himself against the rock, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. He was outnumbered, unarmed, and barely standing. Not great odds. But then, a scream. Zura. Ethan's blood ran cold. He peered over the edge and saw her, just a few meters away. Trapped. Ayla was in her arms, her back against the canyon wall. A squad of troopers surrounded her, weapons drawn. And in front of them, Dakaris himself. The warlord stood tall, his dark armor gleaming under the pale light. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with cruel amusement. You really thought you could escape me? Dakaris sneered. Pathetic. Zura clutched Ayla tightly, her expression defiant. You'll never have her. Dakaris chuckled. Oh, but I already do. He lifted his hand, and a pair of mechanical cuffs snapped around Zura's wrists. Ayla screamed. Ethan's grip tightened on the ladder. No, he wasn't letting this happen. Adrenaline drowned out the pain. He moved, silent as a shadow, creeping toward the closest soldier. Then, in one swift motion, he struck. He grabbed the trooper's rifle and slammed it into the soldier's head. One down. Before the others could react, Ethan spun and fired. A plasma shot burned through the chest of another. Two down. The rest turned, weapons raised. But Ethan was already moving. He dove, rolling behind a boulder as blaster fire ripped through the air. Dakaris's smile faded. Kill him. The soldiers advanced, but they had made one mistake. They had forgotten Zura. Still cuffed, she lunged at the nearest trooper, kicking his legs out from under him. His gun flew from his hands, straight to Ethan. Ethan caught it and fired. The canyon lit up with plasma bursts. Troopers fell one by one, their armor smoking. The tide had turned. Dekaris growled, eyes narrowing. Enough. He grabbed Zyra by the throat, lifting her effortlessly. Ayla screamed again, struggling against the grip of a remaining trooper. Ethan's blood boiled. No more. He leveled his rifle at Dekaris. Let her go. The warlord smirked. Or what? You won't risk hitting her. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. And then, a whisper of movement. Dekaris stiffened. His eyes widened. He choked. Zyra had driven a hidden dagger straight into his ribs. Dekaris stumbled back, gasping. His armor cracked, dark liquid spilling from the wound. Zyra wrenched the blade free. That was for my people. Dekaris staggered, reaching for her, but Ethan was faster. He fired. The shot hit Dekaris square in the chest. The warlord stumbled once, then twice. His body swayed. Then he fell, vanishing into the endless abyss below. Silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the last remaining trooper dropped his weapon and ran. It was over. Zyra collapsed to her knees, gasping. Ethan rushed to her, unlocking the cuffs with a stolen key. Ayla threw herself into his arms, sobbing. You came back, Zyra whispered. Ethan managed a weak smile. I told you, I don't leave people behind. Zyra looked up at him, something unreadable in her eyes. A new life. A new beginning. The three of them stood together at the edge of the canyon, free. And for the first time in a long time, the future was theirs to choose.